Okay, we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. My name's Jane Nick Ennis from Riverine Plains, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our drought preparation webinar series, a project supported by FRRR through funding from the Australian Government Future Drought Fund. A disclaimer, Riverine Plains would like to inform attendees and viewers that the opinions and thoughts expressed in this webinar reflect only the speaker's views and are not necessarily the views of Riverine Plains. The aim of this webinar is to discuss and brainstorm some drought preparation strategies with input from our guest speakers, Kirsten Barlow, who is a principal scientist with Precision Ag, and Nick Ennis, the regional manager of Lawson Grains in southern New South Wales. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kate Parker, our new livestock officer, who will be helping me manage the chat and facilitating questions. If you think of any questions while we're speaking, could you please put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them when the opportunity arises. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a short survey. If you could take 5 minutes to fill out, it would be muchly appreciated. The link will appear on your screen as the webinar ends. Our first speaker for this evening is Kirsten Barlow, Principal Scientist with Precision Ag. Kirsten, can you please give us a brief background of your role with Precision Ag?
Thanks, Jane, and welcome everyone. Obviously, I work for Precision Ag and we're a soil health business using, I suppose, science and technology to support farmers and industries throughout southeastern Australia. I really have two key roles with precision agriculture. Firstly, it's around providing the soil expertise and knowledge to ensure that our soil testing methods and reporting is really robust and is providing the insights that will enable actions from farmers on the ground. Secondly, I lead the research and innovation team. We run a number of soil-based research projects, both internal and external, predominantly around soil management questions, including carbon, acidity and nitrogen. Over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Our second speaker we have with us tonight is Nick Ennis, who is the Regional Manager of Lawson Grains in southern New South Wales. And we'll get Nick to give us a little bit of information about what he's up to daily.
Thanks, Jane. So as you said, and welcome everyone. I'm the Regional Manager in southern New South Wales with Lawson Grains. I directly manage Bramble, which is about 8,500 hectares of country from Howlong through to Daysdale Rand area, and have oversight over another aggregation around Urana and Oaklands called Grasmere, which is another 10,000 hectares there. So daily, it can vary wildly from being in the office, running the business to being on the ground, assisting the guys operating and getting the job done, and have a real passion for precision agriculture and soil amelioration.
Thanks, Nick. So I guess to start off, when thinking about drought or any seasonal conditions, and specifically thinking about soils, I guess the one thing that comes to mind for me is soil health. So I guess we'll start with Kirsten. How do we go about measuring soil health?
Starting with the small questions, Jane. Soil health, I suppose, it means, one of the challenges is it means different things to a lot of people. You look at the formal definitions around soil health, and they talk about it being the capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, humans, the environment. It can do everything. I suppose if we bring it back down to a more farm focused, it's about a soil that can support productive agricultural systems into the future, that can provide the nutrients. It's got a good microbial population. It's got good water infiltration. It's got all of those aspects that make it a good production system and powerhouse for that soil, but is also sort of robust and resilient when we hit tough times, be they really wet years or really dry years. when we start looking at how we can measure it, I suppose there's three components that we tend to think about when we think about soil health. There's the chemical side of things, so questions around soil acidity, sodicity, sorry, nutrient availability of the soils. Then we can start looking at the physical side of the soils. So do we have a really good, strong structure within our soil? Can our water get into our soils? Can it hold the water over time? And then we move along to our, what am I missing? The biological side, the important side. And then we move into looking at our soil biology. Do we have good, healthy soils that are providing an environment with a robust microbial population to really support that cycling of nutrients and that building of a robust system? Measuring soil health probably depends on where you're coming from. So often as a starting point, you start focusing in on those chemical concerns. So if I do have an issue around soil acidity, there's probably not a lot of point in going and doing a lot of biological microbial testing, because you know that your key constraint in your soil is probably going to be that soil acidity. So you want to start with that first constraint, those biggest constraints in your system, address them, and then build that picture of your and knowledge of your soil over time.
Okay, great. So we need to test what we're looking for, really. And Nick, I guess when you think about soil health, what's your first thought in how to measure?
I'll probably just furthering on from what Kirsten was saying as well. I think it's really important to before you actually measure anything or measure even what success looks like, is to understand constraint in the soil, like Kirsten was saying, and primarily in our area being in southern New South Wales, northern Victoria, or the Riverine Plains, is soil acidity. So we need to make sure that the soil is, or the acidity is rectified if there is an acidic problem. And then measuring it for me is doing a lot of trials, a lot of tests to understand what the soil can actually produce. But first of all, like really picking at that low-hanging fruit, which is getting rid of compaction, rectifying any acidity, and then looking at understanding what your water holding capacity in the soil is, and then ultimately understanding how much water you've got in the soil at any particular period of time. But certainly, alleviating compaction if you can. Obviously, there's a lot of livestock in our area as well, so that can be a bit of a challenge. But for a continual cropper or someone that's got 100% crop and no livestock, that's quite easy to rectify in terms of controlled traffic farming and stubble retention.
And Nick, from your experience through previous droughts, when do you think it's most important to look at your soils?
I think it's important to look at your soil all the time. It's quite interesting now. Obviously, we've had a huge amount of rain. The bucket in a lot of areas is quite full, and now's the time to understand, how much moisture will your soil hold. So when you're leading into a drought, or like Kirsten was saying before, potentially waterlogging conditions, or any time of the year, is understanding what you can produce with that bucket that you've got. So leading into a drought, say we'll take maybe even last year, 2021 for an example, like we've had a really good year. Discounting the amount of rain that we've had now, like we left the harvest last year coming into January and February with quite a lot of soil moisture. So I think it's really important to understand how much moisture you've got available in the soil at any particular date. And then looking at long-term forecasts, which can be a little bit deceiving. They can, sometimes they're not particularly accurate as well. But using that sort of information to understand what sort of risks you could be facing down the track, whether it be drought, excessive rainfall or too much water or whatever the case may be. So just using those simple little tools like understanding how much water your soil can actually hold.
Yeah, great. Kirsten, when we're talking about measuring our soils, we say we've got to understand what's happening and what our limitations are. When we go about measuring and say we're looking at the chemical part of it, how important is it to measure different parts of a paddock?
Great. Thanks, Jane. I think that really builds on from what Nick's talking about in terms of that variability you see in the paddock and those wet areas and the dry areas within a paddock. And whatever strategy you use to look at your soils, it's important that you choose a robust strategy that works within your system. So it might be that you choose a really good, let's see if this works. Hang on. Here's some prompts I prepared earlier. So you might choose to go with something like a traditional soil sampling plan. If you think your soils are reasonably uniform, the yields you get off your paddock are reasonably uniform, you don't have areas where you get a lot of waterlogging or that seem to be really dry in those, sort of exceptionally dry in those drier periods, then that might be a good approach to give you a good handle on that 0 to 10 centimetre soil profile. But what we actually see, particularly in this area, but across southeastern Australia, is you actually get a lot of soil variation across the paddock. So in precision ag, we most regularly use a grid soil sampling strategy, and that allows us to really pinpoint where the specific soil constraints might be. So this is a bit busy and I do apologise for that, but if you look at the top row, there's 4 maps there of a paddock. Red means there's a soil constraint. Blue and green tend to mean it's pretty good and the soil's pretty happy. So first up, we've got pH, and there's a lot of this paddock obviously that has a pH soil constraint in that 0 to 10 centimetres. But some of the areas that are quite good for pH, for example, up here, actually then when you go across and look at those, they have a phosphorus constraint. So there's a lot going on with your soils in the system, and that phosphorus constraint might be driven by the fact that that's your high yielding area of your paddock. Year on year, you're pulling more phosphorus out because you're getting more yield because it's not pH constrained. So all these interactions between your soil condition and your yields create that variability across your paddock. And so this sort of approach where you really target in your sampling across your paddock to look at that variability means when you come down to this bottom row of maps, we can vary our lime rates in this first map here. We can vary those lime rates based on where the soil is most acidic. So we're not putting a blanket rate out. We're not putting lime out where our pH is 5.5. We don't need it. We're putting all our lime where it's down at 4.2. We're really focusing on those constraints. Similarly with our phosphorus rates, we might put a starter P across the paddock, but we're actually going to focus our capital phosphorus inputs to those areas where we've got that constraint on productivity. Similarly, as we move across, if we look at potassium, we look at exchangeable sodium. So there's advantages to doing a grid type sampling approach because you get to really target your inputs, but a good paddock scale sample will also give a lot of input and information about your paddock. So don't feel afraid to use soil testing of any type. Any testing is good testing. I suppose as we move on from there, once you've started to get a feel for your 0 to 10 centimetre soil layer, you might still have constraints in the paddock, and that's where we need to start looking a little bit deeper. A lot of you are probably aware of the really good work of Helen Burns and Jason Condon and stuff around that subsurface acidity. This is some work that we did with FarmLink. And what we can see there is, say we take this green line here, it's got an average pH of about 5.2 in that 0 to 10 centimetre layer. If you saw that on a soil test, you go, that's pretty good, I'm pretty happy with that. But what we actually find is because we've get that stratification within the soil over time, that we actually have layers in the soil that might be down at 4.8, or more extreme sort of situation could be sitting down at 4.6 or lower in that sort of 5 to 10, 10 to 15 centimetre layer. So you might actually want to come in, if you think there's still a constraint to your production, and look at finer segments of your soil sample, because that might identify the fact that overall your pH is pretty good, but you've still got a band somewhere within your soil profile that the roots just can't get through. And particularly from a drought resilience point of view, if you're constraining that root growth, that the water that your plant's got access to can be quite limited. All right, stop there. How do I stop? Stop. Sorry, technology. I think 2 years of this, I'd have nailed it.
Thanks, Kirsten. So I guess the really important point there is it doesn't matter how you do the sampling, as long as you're doing some sampling, and as long as when you do it the next time, you do it in the same way. So always make sure you GPS reference where you take your samples so you can go back later and measure if there's been a change.
Jane, I might just jump in and say the other really important thing there is if you are measuring year on year, you measure at the same time of year. So you always want to sample in autumn or in summer or in spring. It doesn't really matter which time of year you pick, but you want to pick the same time of year because a lot of those nutrients and inputs do vary a bit over time on sort of an annual cycle. So you want to keep a consistent sampling time as well.
So we might go to you now, Nick, and just if you can share your experiences of what you've found with your soils and how it's benefited you to make some changes, and what benefits, I suppose, it's had for you.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And probably going on from what Kirsten was saying, looking at soil tests across regions and across fields. It's not until you start really getting down below that 0 to 10, so the 10 to 30 and 30 to 60, where you can still really start seeing constraint. We did a lot of EM surveying in 2013, 2014, just to map the soil for a start, but then started seeing over time some particularly ugly pH levels at depth. And we're talking sort of 20 to 40 centimetres. Lost you. Back again. Sorry. Yeah, we started seeing or really identifying areas in sandy soil in particular that was highly acidic at sort of 20 to 40 centimetres deep. And we're talking pHs of sub 4 and down as low as 3.2. So roots from absolutely everything's getting down to that layer, being pruned, and obviously the crops, they're running out of moisture and nutrient. Started identifying those areas, digging soil pits, and trying to get an understanding of what's going on down below that level as well, and found that the pH down below sort of 40 centimetres in that sandy soil was almost alkaline. So after a trip to Western Australia, to a couple of our farms in Western Australia where they've been doing some deep ripping and spading, actually bought a spader and did what the guys in WA were doing with similar sort of soil for different sort of reasons, but I saw it as being a benefit to our soil here, and did quite a lot of deep ripping and spading and rectified quite a lot of our highly acidic sandy soil. So I might just share a couple of slides as well to give you an understanding of what or how we turn some of that soil around. So the first slide is just an EM survey from a field down near Howlong, and you can see that really dark red soil is, or that dark red area here is very, very sandy soil, leading up to some quite heavy, some heavy clay down in the south of that particular field. And following on from that is a canola yield from 2014. And you can see that really sandy soil just yielded terribly. where the lowest yield in that particular field, I think, what's it say there? Low, I can't see it without my glasses on, but it was like under half a tonne anyway. It was really, really bad. So we knew we had to do something. So in 2016, we did a deep ripping and spading program over that area that was really poor and really deep white sand and very highly acidic. And then in 2017, well, I'll go one step backwards. 2016 was quite difficult in that particular paddock because it was very, very wet. So the deep ripping and spading, we deep ripped down to 700 and spaded to 450 or 400 mil. The amount of rainfall we had over that particular field and everywhere we deep ripped and spaded, basically we couldn't even walk across it, let alone drive machinery over it. But the following year, canola in 2017, you can see where that poor area, we've reduced that really poor area back down to a very, very small area. Just discount probably the western half of that paddock because we had a problem with millipedes and slugs. So that's where there's a bit of noise here in that particular yield map. But a comparison between 2014 and 2017 of what that soil amelioration did in that particular sandy area is quite stark. And it still continues to produce really well now. Although after sort of 5 years, we're finding that that it is that particular sand is starting to compact again at about sort of 400 mil deep. So we've actually put a horse tiger over it and applied a capital application of the lime to correct that pH as well. But that's just an example of how you can identify a poor performing area and potentially rectify it.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I guess one of the really important things with any soil amelioration is getting that advice of what's down below, which you obviously did a lot of research into what was happening below, your top 10 centimetres, and making sure that whatever you did wasn't going to make the situation worse. So, while the amelioration technique that you performed was suitable for your sandy soils, I guess it's just worth saying that whatever amelioration technique that is appropriate, that you seek advice, which you would have done.
I think that's a really good call, Jane. We found in the past we've done some trials with deep ripping in different soil types, and depending on the soil type, you can actually damage it significantly if you start putting or try to change the structure of the soil at depth. So yeah, you really do need to get some very good advice from obviously leaders in the field like Kirsten and yourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Great. We might just pass over to Kate now for some questions. We've had a few questions come in, so I'll hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Jane. I didn't want to jump in on top of those great responses and discussion we were having there. For Nick, on your soil moisture, just a question on how you measure your soil moisture going into sowing.
Yeah, great question. So I've actually got some probes, some soil moisture probes scattered around the farms, which are extremely beneficial. But
oh, we've lost you again there, Nick.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, we've got some soil moisture probes scattered around the place, but I think it's really you don't necessarily need to have moisture probes in the ground either. You can use something as simple as a moisture probe that you punch into the ground yourself to understand what sort of constraint, or trying to get an understanding of how much moisture is down through the surface. You can dig a hole with an auger to see how much moisture is there. But I think it's also really important to understand the moisture holding capacity of the soil as well. And you can do that in a number of ways. It's probably better off to get an expert like Kirsten to do that sort of test for you. But you can apply a certain amount of moisture to soil over a period of 24 hours through putting a 1,000-litre IBC on top of the ground and letting it drip into the ground and seeing how much it takes until it just can't take any more, and then dig it up and see how deep that moisture goes. But you really do need to carry a shovel with you, or an auger, or just a moisture probe to jam into the ground and just see how far down how down your moisture is. An old rule of thumb is like if you're using fallow, and I know a lot of guys in northern New South Wales and that use long fallow practices. You've got half a metre of moisture, where you plant half your crop. You've got a metre of moisture, you can plant all your crop. That's just one example, I suppose, but you do need to understand how much moisture is there. Yeah, and that probably leads on to more drought, or how you can manage leading into a drought as well. If you can understand how much moisture you've got, you can make decisions on what sort of crop you're going to plant also. So if you haven't got a lot of moisture stored in your soil, you're not going to plant a risky crop in a drier environment. And I call risky, it could be something as fantastic at the moment as canola, but if you're going into a dry environment where you know that you're potentially going into a hostile subsoil, you're not going to really push that canola crop, because you could potentially come out badly at the end, because you could run out of moisture. And the season could turn bad on you. So I talk about rules of engagement. So you have potentially at our aggregation at Oaklands that we'd need to have 60 mils of stored soil moisture before we even consider planting canola.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. I think that's answered that very well, Nick. So definitely a shovel is better than nothing, and understand your soil. Definitely a really good advice coming into, if it is going to be a dry season, to know what your soils can handle. And like you say, you don't want to be running out on some of those crops after they've come up. Give them the best chance. Couple more here. Summer weed control. Critical to keeping soil moisture, keeping moisture in the soil, sorry. Would you like to comment on control of summer weeds and the soil moisture?
Yes, for me, it's absolutely paramount. You cannot let any summer weeds grow. Any moisture that they take out from your soil is going to be moisture taken away from the following crop. So it's obviously you can't go out and blanket spray a whole field of, whether it's 1 hectare or 10,000 hectares. If there's only a scattered plant here and there, obviously that's where things like a weed seeker come into play. But there comes a time where there's a threshold you need to spray. So I'd work on 5 or 6% that you really start needing to look at that field. Once you're getting up to 10% ground cover or weed cover, you really need to start thinking about knocking them out.
Excellent. I think that you hit the word you used there, threshold, knowing your threshold. I think that comes into a lot with drought management of things as well, and use of inputs, knowing those thresholds that you've got, whether it be for use of controlling weeds or for pests. Know those thresholds and know when to use something, or when it might be best to save that for another time. Yeah. I might throw a question out. It might be one for Kirsten. Do we know of any tests becoming available in the future to test for herbicide and pesticide damage to the soil microbes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of soil microbes, we're still, the soil testing capabilities are still being developed. I think we need to accept that that's still an emerging area of science. So in terms of things that are sort of generally available, you've got sort of your microbial biomass and things like that as a general sort of microbial test, which really just looks at the overall volume of the population in there. And if you are doing that kind of testing over time, you will potentially see some changes in your overall microbial biomass, potentially from herbicide or pesticide damage. But in terms of actually something that can specifically target types of microbes and types of damage, we're just not there yet with the science that I'm aware of. I think it's still all in development.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, we might keep going. So I guess both of you might be able to have a bit of a go at this, but Nick, when we're talking about, so we've had some tests, we've worked out what our limitations in our soil are. How do we prioritise our soil operations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think priority is to first get, like I was saying before, about picking at that low-hanging fruit. So making sure you get the really basics and the fundamentals right. Making sure you create correct pH. Make sure you've got enough phosphorus in the soil, like you're giving enough phosphorus for the crop. Simple things like sulfur. Is that available? Is there any other constraints there? And just and then once you understand just the simple fundamentals of the soil and the stuff that you can pick at really easily, is then you can start looking at micronutrients and trace elements to help really boost the crop along. And I think once you've done what you can in some difficult soil, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So you can get a bucket of sand; it's still going to be a bucket of sand. So it's still not going to hold a huge amount of water. So it's not going to be a best hectare of soil. So understand what your constraint is firstly with chemical, like Kirsten was saying before, but also understand that some soil you're just not going to get a huge amount out of it. So you then need to potentially limit what you're putting into that soil and putting more into some soil next to it that has a better water holding capacity, for example, to then push the production out of that higher producing soil. So correct everything you possibly can first, and then if necessary, understand that some soil is it's pretty ordinary. Do what you can with it, and then move on to the really good stuff that you've got, and push that as hard as you can. But always stink testing it by putting extra applications of or like a higher application of lime, a higher application of nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever the case may be, to make sure that you're not also limiting that soil by not applying enough.
Yeah, great.
If that makes any sense. Sure
does. Kirsten, I've got one for you. Obviously, is there any, coming out of a drought, so say we've had 2 or 3 years of drought, can that do any damage to the soils? Is there a recovery phase after a drought when we're talking about soils?
Oh, that's a good question, Jane. I think there will be a recovery phase, particularly if we've had a few years of drought. I mean, if we look at it over a few years, you're going to have potentially have lost some organic carbon within your soils, which is going to have had effect. You probably haven't been putting in the nutrients that you normally would. So there's going to be a whole bunch of things that are probably not where you'd optimally have them sort of in your year-to-year operations in a good year, because you're going to have been tightening those reins on everything all the way through, and your carbon is going to drop down over time. So there is going to be a recovery phase coming out, and I think the challenge coming out is obviously you've had a few bad years, so purse strings are going to be tight, but you need to put enough in once you start getting that rain coming in. You need to put enough nutrients into the system to get those crops moving. So make sure there's sufficient starter P to get that crop out of the ground in that first year once you've got good rain and good water sitting before you.
Yeah, great. So Nick, if you had limited resources, what would be the first thing you do to prepare for a drought, thinking about your soils with limited resources?
Yeah, gee, that's really interesting. I'd probably look at the water market and put a bore down and start irrigating. But obviously, that aside, no, I think just using as much information as I possibly can and surrounding myself with really good people and technology to understand the soil as best we possibly can, to understand primarily the water holding capacity of the soil and understand that really, really well. And also, what sort of infiltration rate you've got in the soil as well. Because as you know, in a drought year of low rainfall, every single millimetre of rainfall that falls, we need to capture and put down into the root zone. So, what's the infiltration rate is like? Is there any compaction there that we can rectify, and how do we rectify that compaction? Like Kirsten was saying before about organic carbon, what sort of levels of carbon we got in the soil? Have we got enough stubble over the top of the soil as a barrier against the sun? So I don't think it's necessarily how much money that if we had an endless bucket of money to spend on that particular hectare or whatever the case may be. For me, I think it's the biggest bang for my buck is understanding the soil as much as we possibly can. And that doesn't necessarily mean spending a lot of money either. But yeah, if I had huge amounts of money, yeah, absolutely, I'd try and find water and irrigate the bloody stuff.
Well, that was my flip side. So if you had an endless bucket of money, I suppose what kind of soil research would you like to see that might help us prepare for future climatic events, whether it be lots of rain and waterlogged soils or droughts and dry soils?
Yeah, I think research is a really interesting one. You can do a lot of research yourself and trying to understand your own soil, but by supporting and putting forward questions to bodies like the GRDC that do a lot of research as well. Gee whiz, I think the most important thing is that you understand as much as you possibly can your own soil, but then also asking questions of your local GRDC guys and girls, posing questions to people like you guys in the Riverine Plains to how can we understand our soil more? What can we do in times of drought? Is there a way that we can how we can do trials on things like row spacings and seed numbers or plant numbers per square metre to use to get the most efficient water use efficiency that we possibly can out of our crops? It's a really big question. I probably can't answer it 100% accurately either, Jane. But I probably bumbled through that one a bit.
That's all right. I guess we've got another question in the chat just about managing stubbles. Obviously, the last few years we've had quite high biomass from stubbles, and I guess just a bit of history of how do you maintain your stubble load, and does it vary year to year depending on the quantity of stubble?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Stubble has become a bit of an issue here certainly over the last 12 months, with the last 2 years in particular of very, very high yielding cereal in particular. So I hate burning. I think that's just a terrible thing to do, although sometimes I've had to do it when I've been forced into a corner. But really, for me, it's cutting the crop as low as I possibly can, and chopping and spreading it behind the behind the headers. When it's excessive, I've been using a Cali chain also. But if I take a step back, probably 15 or 16 years ago, looking at trying to get through heavy stubble, if you can't get through it, I thought you go wider with your row spacings. You go wider and wider until you can get through it. And that worked, but I think ultimately it probably put a bit of a ceiling on the yield that we could get in a high rainfall year. So I actually went back the other way and went to narrow row spacings and tried to deal with the stubble in a different way by cutting it really short and chopping and spreading it. Yeah, but I think you also need, there comes a time you also need to use a bit of steel, like a Cali chain or something similar, or a speed tiller, whatever the case may be, to incorporate that stubble as well. So look, I'm thinking now that it might be a good opportunity for us in the canola phase to, or after canola harvest, to smash a canola stubble with steel. To also get rid of that canola stubble, but also to smash up the previous cereal stubbles as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? We're just trying to keep it there, but do it so it doesn't impact our next season. And there's a lot happening at the moment, given that we've had a few big years, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. Kate, did you want to?
Probably a comment there, more than a question. Someone's put in there, best long-term sustainability strategy would be to have good soils in good health prior to a drought, and some finance preserved to manage the soils. And I think that's what you, Nick and Kirsten, said before, and that's a really good summary in there. So yeah, having that soil in good health and knowing what you've got in your soils and how it holds with your nutrients as well as your water, certainly, and some money there to help that next crop out of the drought come up properly and to its full fruition. So that was a good one. We do have another question. And you might both want to have a go at it. I'll ask it first, and then you can choose. It's looking like a wet winter and spring ahead. What should our N strategy be? So with the timing and the quantity of N. So who wants to have a go at that one? Nick? Is it more practical?
Yeah, sure. I'll have a go first, and then Kirsten can correct me, I'm sure. Once again, you've got to understand how much nitrogen you've got available in the soil. And then obviously input like urea prices are through the roof. So you don't want to just throw it out willy-nilly, of course, but you also need to make sure you achieve as much as you possibly can in a year of such high wheat and canola and barley prices. So firstly, I always do a nitrogen budget. So working on how much nitrogen it will take to grow 1 tonne of canola, 1 tonne of barley or wheat, and then put in some, just some simple factors around efficiency of nitrogen. So look, to roughly, like, depending on how much nitrogen we had in the soil, if I was targeting 4 tonne of wheat, I'd be looking at applying 200 kilos of urea, for example. That's very, very rough, but I think there's some other really, really good tools to use. In particular, is yield profit. I've been using yield profit for a long time to understand how much nitrogen we've got in the soil, also understand how much moisture we've got in the soil, and then using their algorithms to predict yield and how much nitrogen we'd look to apply to achieve maximum yield out of that ground.
That was great, Nick. I don't think I need to add anything at all to that. I think you've summed it up nicely. It's, yeah, you really need to know what's in your soil profile to start with, so you know how much is there. Particularly if you've had a pulse crop or something in the year before, you might have some good nitrogen already in the soil profile. You don't want to be buying urea if it's already there for the season. and I suppose be willing to adjust over time. So if you think you normally come in at this time of year and you've got good moisture and you think I might be aiming for a 4-ton crop, if you get a bit further down the season and it's looking even better, then be prepared to put that bit extra out, because you don't want to get to the end of the year and realise you've starved that crop.
Yeah, just further on. Oh, sorry, Kirsten. I was just going to say, further on from that, when testing for DPAN, when's the best time to do it, and does it make a difference doing it incremental or just one increment?
We generally recommend doing sort of 2 depths, so generally a 0 to 30, 30 to 60. The reason we suggest that is if most of your nitrogen is sitting in your 30 to 60, for example, because you've drawn really heavily on that surface nitrogen the year before, you might have a shortcoming in nitrogen available to that young crop when it's only got sort of shallower roots. So it's really about working whereabouts in your profile your nitrogen is and when the crop's going to be able to get to it. So that's why we generally sort of recommend a dual depth sort of sample, but that obviously does cost more in terms of the analytical costs. So if you only come at a 0 to 60, that's an awesome way of getting some good data as well. So whatever works for you, but getting that incremental really does allow you to work out where the nitrogen's sitting at the start of the season. In terms of timing, we tend to start doing DPAN sampling from sort of towards the end of mid-late March, and we're still sampling now. So you can sample at any stage. It just, I suppose, affects the calculations a bit in terms of what you're seeing in the soil. So if you've already got your crop up and out of the ground, then you need to take that into consideration when you look at your overall end budget. So it probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference what time of year you need to be able to get on the soil. Might be a problem at the moment in some areas. So that is a consideration. So if you do it early, we can adjust for the likely mineralisation things that will occur between when you sample and when the crop's looking for that nitrogen. So we can adjust those things around as we need to.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, did you have something to add before?
Did, but I've forgotten it now, Jane.
No, that's okay. So I guess we're almost coming to the end. If anyone's got any more questions, just pop them in the chats and we can answer them. You mentioned before, Nick, when we were talking about droughts and community, and I guess one of the things we've spoken about in a drought is support from those around you. And when we talked about moisture, I think it's important to understand what's happening on the boundaries, I suppose, of your farm, so you can not only know where you're at, but it might give you a bit of an understanding what else is happening around. How important is that network of support when you're looking at what to do with your soils?
Oh, I think it's absolutely vital, Jane. It's absolutely vital. You can get very caught up in your own little world with blinkers on and thinking you're doing the right thing. But unless you're looking over the fence, unless you're talking to experts, gaining experience or getting experience from others, you really don't know how you can measure your success in terms of what other people are doing in the area. So you might be happy with a water use efficiency of I don't know, 11 kilos per millimetre of rain in wheat, but there could be others around doing 18. So you really need to understand what's going on around you as well. You don't necessarily need to be going out there and waving banners around, all that sort of stuff, but I think it's really important to have a really good network and also be prepared if you do have a win to share that win with others as well, in terms of, like, you've made a really good learning I think it's really important to share that learning with others as well, so they can pass on that knowledge.
Yeah, great. Just talking about wins. Look, at hindsight's always a wonderful thing. Is there anything you've tried soil wise that might not have panned out quite so well?
Yeah, absolutely. Crikey. I'd deep rip some heavy clay thing. It was, I'd try and make it look like the Liverpool Plains, but basically made it slump and it still buggered. You need to put a lot of organic material down through into that soil to try and rectify, pulling big tines down to 750 mil through soil that doesn't like to be disturbed. That's probably the biggest learning or biggest mistake in that particular area. Lucky it wasn't a big area, but I thought I knew what to do there, and I just went wildly into it, and it's still underperforming to this day. So I suppose, like you're talking about before, like make sure you get some advice, which would have been helpful in that regard. Yeah,
that's right. We have to learn. So I guess can't see many more questions coming through. So I guess just a few key points from tonight is knowing your soils. It doesn't matter what year it is. You need to understand your soils, whether it be a good year or a bad year. So make sure that you do some kind of testing. It doesn't matter what kind of testing, as long as it's kept consistent, and to know what your limitations are. If you're ameliorating and trying to fix that limitation, then do the area that's going to have the biggest impact first. And then I guess have a wish list. So plan for your biggest impact first. You don't need lots of equipment to measure what's beneath the surface. A shovel is quite sufficient. If you think you've got a limitation, dig a hole and see what's down there. And same with moisture. It's easy to dig a hole or stick a probe down. So I'd just like to thank Nick and Kirsten for their input this evening, and my co-host Kate. Just a quick advertisement. This is the second webinar series. We have 2 more. So the next 2 Tuesdays, we'll be running more webinars, one on livestock and one on ag tech. So if you keep an eye out for our socials for the invites, and also on our webinar for this webinar, as well as the past webinar on grains and marketing last week. So keep an eye out for those. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope you keep nice and warm over the next week and stay dry. So thanks again, Nick and Kirsten, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Shane. See you later.
Thanks, Jane.